Here's something strange happening inside the most powerful foreign policy apparatus on Earth. Two of the most senior officials in the United States government, men who, by the rules of their offices, are supposed to speak with one voice, keep showing up to clean something up, something that wasn't theirs to make. Watch closely, because the pattern matters more than any single moment. Consider this. When a Secretary of State has to spend the first 20 minutes of a diplomatic meeting explaining what the president actually meant, that's not a communications problem. That's a structural one. When a Secretary of Defense issues a clarifying statement about American military posture hours after the president's social media post rewrote it, that's not spin. That's damage control with a flag on it. Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth are two of the most prominent faces of American power right now. So why do they so often look like men reading from a script they didn't write and aren't entirely sure they believe? That's the thread. And once you see it, it's very hard to unsee. Let's establish who we're dealing with, because context here is everything. Marco Rubio came up in the Senate as a foreign policy institutionalist, a hawkish, careful, deeply traditional thinker about American power. He believed in alliances. He believed in the deliberate architecture of American diplomatic engagement. He once called Donald Trump a con artist during the 2016 primary. He lost to him. And then years later became his Secretary of State. That arc matters. That arc is not incidental to this story. Pete Hegseth arrived at the Pentagon as a television commentator, a Fox News personality whose profile was built not on military strategy briefings, but on cultural grievance and proximity to the president's media preferences. His confirmation was contentious. His background was unconventional by any modern standard for the office. But he was loyal. And in this White House, loyalty has always been the first prerequisite, with competence somewhere further down the list. Both men operate in worlds diplomacy and defense where words are weapons, where ambiguity is dangerous, where a single misstatement can tilt an alliance or embolden an adversary. They know this, their careers have taught them this, which is why what we're watching is so telling. Here's what we know piece by piece. Political analysts covering the State Department have noted a recurring rhythm to Rubio's public appearances. A Trump statement lands typically through social media, typically without the traditional interagency consultation process, and Rubio is then dispatched or dispatches himself to the phones, to the briefing room, to allied capitals to explain. The explanation is almost always framed diplomatically. But the subtext, to anyone who reads diplomatic language carefully, is unmistakable. That is not exactly what we meant, and here is what we are actually doing. This is not normal. Secretaries of State do not routinely spend their political capital clarifying the president. They extend it. They amplify it. When there is daylight, even a sliver between a Secretary of State's characterization of policy and the president's public declaration of it, that is a sign of something happening underneath the surface. With Hegseth, the pattern looks slightly different but originates from the same source. Defense posture is enormously sensitive. What the Pentagon says about force readiness, about military commitments to allies, about the thresholds of American military response, etc. A lot of it is parsed, recorded, and analyzed by every intelligence service and defense ministry on the planet. When that signal gets scrambled by an unexpected presidential post or an offhand remark at a press conference, the Pentagon has to recalibrate in real time. Hegseth has had to do this multiple times. Each clarification requires him to stand somewhere between what the commander-in-chief said publicly and what the institutional military requires to function with credibility. Notice that neither man has broken. Neither has gone to the press with frustration attributed to a senior official. Neither has written the tell-all resignation letter. They are still there, still present, still showing up. But the body language of their public statements, the careful hedging, the over-explanation, the slightly too earnest emphasis on what the president has been very clear about reads less like confidence and more like men performing steadiness they have had to manufacture. And here is where it clicks. The foreign policy framework of this administration, as characterized by analysts across the ideological spectrum, not partisans, but people who study this professionally as 1.0, oriented toward spectacle over structure, toward the announcement rather than the negotiation, toward the headline that lands in the morning news cycle rather than the agreement that holds for a decade. That is a genuine governing philosophy, and it has genuine adherents. But it creates a specific and brutal problem for the people below the president who have to actually implement policy in the real world, where the other side of the table has its own analysts, its own long memories, and its own patience. Rubio, as a diplomat, needs counterparts to trust that what he says in a room will hold, that the framework he's building will not be unilaterally revised by a 6 a.m. post before his plane lands back in Washington. Hegseth, as a defense chief, needs allies to trust that American security commitments are durable, that they are institutional, not personal, not subject to the mood of a single man's weekend. When the president's operating style makes those assurances difficult to deliver, both men are left holding an umbrella in a storm they didn't forecast and cannot stop. That is the quiet discomfort you are watching, not rebellion, not resignation, something more complicated and, in some ways, more revealing. Men doing the work of two jobs simultaneously, their own. And the president's afterthought. Here's the part that should concern all of us. American foreign policy and defense posture do not function in isolation. They function in relationship to NATO allies who have been quietly alarmed for years, to adversaries who read every gap between Washington's official statements and the president's social feed as an invitation, to partners in the Indo-Pacific who are calculating right now whether American security guarantees are worth the paper they're printed on. When the two men most responsible for delivering those guarantees spend a measurable portion of their time managing the fallout from unpredictable decision-making at the top, that is capacity being consumed. That is credibility being spent. And credibility in diplomacy and defense is not replenished overnight. It accumulates over years of consistency. It evaporates sometimes in a single news cycle. There is also a democratic accountability question here that is easy to miss. If the policy that Rubio is explaining to foreign ministers is materially different from the policy the president announced, NCED, which one is the policy? Who decided? Through what process? The American public and, frankly, the American Congress has an interest in knowing whether foreign policy is being made or whether it is being improvised and then formalized after the fact. The gap between those two things is not procedural. It is constitutional. Two questions remain open, and they're the ones worth sitting with. The first, how long can this pattern hold? Institutions absorb a certain amount of internal tension before they fracture or adapt. Both Rubio and Hegseth have shown remarkable discipline in maintaining public solidarity. But the tightrope they walk gets thinner with each episode. The question is not whether there is strain inside this foreign policy apparatus. The evidence suggests there is. The question is when and how that strain surfaces in a way that has consequences for actual American interests. The second, what are the allies doing in the meantime? Because foreign governments are not passive observers of Washington's internal dynamics. They are adaptive. And the adaptation, the hedging of bets, the quiet conversations with other powers, the slow recalibration of who gets true.
Stead with what may already be underway in ways that will take years to fully see.
The most important things in Washington rarely announce themselves. They accumulate quietly in the space between what people say and what they actually mean.